Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Gospel Topics Essays. This series, if this is your first episode, is a look at each of these essays, which is found on the LDS Church's website. churchofchrist.org, is that what it is now? LDS.org is what my head is still...
churchofjesuschrist.org.
Can't forget the first name. So churchofjesuschrist.org. You can read along with us. The purpose of all these episodes, and we'll introduce you to that mystery voice and two other voices today here in a moment, but you can read along with us because what we do on these episodes is we read through each of the essays and we have each of our hosts explain a little bit about their experience as they learn this information, as they started digging into the footnotes and different sources that the footnotes are referring to. And it's a way for us to try to show what our personal experiences were with this new information and maybe some places that the essay decided not to go, or some places it went that was confusing, what we like about it, what we don't like about it. It's just kind of a personal conversation between these four people. So what we're going to do on this episode is I'm going to have Anthony, who's been the coordinator, the organizer of this group of four hosts. I'm going to turn it over to you, Anthony, who you've been a common voice on all these episodes. Would love to hear your thoughts on the other hosts. And now there's this shroud of mystery because we haven't explained who these other two hosts are yet. It's so exciting. But I'd love for you to explain kind of your thought process and introduce our host real quick before we get to the essay.
Thank you very much, Allan. So I wanted to start out with, as an intro to this essay episode, to be clear that with a personal explanation about myself and a few thoughts about what we are trying to accomplish today. So first, I've actually really been looking forward to this episode because it was actually this essay, the Race and the Priesthood essay with the footnotes and the cited sources, that really ended up changing my life when I stumbled across this essay back on April 29th, 2016. The essay was what forever changed my beliefs and relationship with the Mormon Church and my constructs for spirituality and divinity. At the same time, I've been kind of procrastinating recording this episode because my acute existential faith and identity crisis that followed my encounter with this essay was a pretty tender, painful period of my life. We've been planning or talking about this episode for over a year now. I want my co-host today and the listener to know how deeply grateful I am for these co-hosts who've chosen to join us today. The second thing that I want to say is, as with the other episodes that we've recorded about the Gospel Topics essays, our emphasis really is to focus on our personal experiences with them and the related material to the essay. With this essay in particular, we could probably do a 10-part series alone. There's so much to talk about, and still not cover everything with regard to these topics. So while we will cover a good amount of material today, this isn't intended to be an all-inclusive episode on these topics by any means. And finally, for the listener, I want you to know that you're going to be graced today with the voices and experiences of my friends Juliana Villegas and Ryan DeRoque. Did I say your name right? Okay.
Yeah, DeRoque.
DeRoque. They have unique experiences and perspectives that they're going to bring to the discussion. Juliana is a person of color, and Ryan is a Caucasian man who discovered with a DNA test that he has mixed race ancestry, which he discovered prior to encountering the race essay. But I want you to know that their voices and experiences are their own, and they're not meant to represent any particular group or demographic. They're here for you, the listener, to hear different experiences with these topics, some of which might be quite different than yours. Just as my experiences and the things that I'll share are not intended to represent all straight white males who have been members of the church, please don't take Juliana's experience to represent all females or all persons of color. And Ryan's experiences are not intended to represent all straight males with mixed race ancestry. So please hold some grace for us in what you hear today in case we don't cover or hit everything that you think would be important with regard to this essay. In the future, we may decide to record additional episodes on these topics and include additional voices that are differentiated from mine and our co-hosts. but I just wanted to be clear for the listener about what we intended to accomplish today. This essay was first published in December, on December 6th of 2013. So as an another introduction to this essay episode, one of my friends was working as a college intern. He's a history major. He's accomplished a master's degree in history. He was an intern in the church history department when several of the essays were developed, including this one. Also, you should know that Dr. Paul Reeve is a professor of history and Mormon studies at the University of Utah and the author of an award-winning book called Religion of a Different Color. Dr. Reeve has explained publicly that he submitted the original material for this essay and that his original submission was much more than 50 pages long with lots of footnotes. And if you want to get a glimpse of what he originally submitted to the church, you could read his book, Religion of a Different Color. The material was subsequently edited and condensed and added to by the church history department under the direction of the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency and a coordinating 70 general authority. What the whole series of events that happened with this essay is very interesting, and I hope that listeners could understand some of the complexities that came out with these essays. So, for example, my friend who was a college intern with the church history department, when this essay was being prepared and released, he wrote a comment about his experience in an interaction that I had with him on my Facebook page about 10 weeks ago. He wrote that the Blacks and Priesthood essay was pushed live practically minutes after the Quorum of the 12 gave the essay the green light because the history department didn't want the quorum to change its mind and stall. It seems like the First Presidency, the entire First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 had to unanimously approve the content of this essay, and likely with all of the essays. And that's interesting to ponder because a lot of times the apologists suggest that the brethren, are focused on administration and they might not know some of the messy details. And I also, when I think of what my friend shared with me, I wondered the extent to which the brethren anticipated that this essay could be one of the most common ones to crash people's metaphorical shelves like it did mine. And anecdotally, with a lot of my friends, they've told me that this is the essay that led them down the rabbit hole. So in any event, that's what I wanted to preface this episode with.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you. Really good context, and I think it adds to the intrigue of why this essay. Why is this the one? So before we dig into that, obviously we want to get to know Juliana and Ryan a little bit. I'm just meeting Juliana today for the first time. Ryan and I, you and I have spoken a few times over the last couple of years, which is great to catch up with you as well. But Juliana, let's have you introduce yourself real quick first so that our listeners can get to know you.
All right. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. I'm, thrilled to do this. So who am I?
Who am I?
So I was raised in the church in Belgium. My mom joined the church. I'm not going to go, telling my whole story. People who are interested can literally Google my name, Juliana Viegas, or formerly Juliana Viegas Haas, and you will find a lot of information about me and my story and my transition story. I currently live in the Dallas area. So yes, I've lived, different places in the world, but currently live here in Dallas. And so at this point, I would say I have 3 kids. My ex-husband was also born and raised LDS, and also left the church. So I'm, we're all out, and I'm not raising my children in the church or anything like that. So I do have a podcast called the Phase Transition Podcast. The idea with that is to help people transitioning, because it's a difficult thing to go through. And I feel like the more resources are out there to help people kind of falling into this new experience that can be very difficult, people need resources. So I felt like because of my own experience, I could maybe share some of the things that have been helpful. I also do have a support group once a month where people who are transitioning out or struggling with different things regarding maybe mixed faith or marriage or things like that, can come in and kind of share their experience in a safe environment, share how they feel. And so other than that, I don't know what else you want to know.
What did you have for breakfast this morning? That's important to know.
Oatmeal.
All right. Perfect. That's great. Now, Juliana, thank you for being here with us. And we would encourage everybody to go and check out the Faith Transition podcast. I was there at Thrive when you spoke, and it was awesome to hear you speak. And we need as many voices as we can in this space to help people. And it's awesome that you took action when you recognized it. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Ryan DeRoque, please.
There we go.
Who is this
Good.
Ryan?
Yes, so I'm Ryan. I live right now in Houston with my wife and 2 boys. I have a 4-year-old and 6-year-old boy. And so I was raised in the church. I grew up in Arkansas, so felt like a minority for sure, being a Mormon in the Bible Belt. That was actually, I think, a really good experience for me. I think everyone could benefit by kind of being a minority of some sort in their life. So I grew up in Arkansas. My dad is a convert. My mom is has pioneer ancestry. So I served a mission in Venezuela, then went out to BYU, got my degree there, and met my wife while I was there as well. And while I was at BYU, I actually there was an Elders Quorum lesson that we had that they talked about family search and researching our family history. And that made me want to kind of look into my own ancestry. I have an aunt that's really into family history, but I had never really looked at it myself. And so that was in early 2013. And so I started to kind of look at my ancestry and realized that I have African ancestry that I didn't know about before. So my 6th great grandfather was an African slave in Connecticut, and we've done a lot of work on that family line. It's my direct paternal line, so that's where my last name comes from. And when I discovered that, so I obviously knew about the race or the ban, the Priesthood Ban, the Priesthood and Temple Ban, but I didn't really think much about it. And so whenever I discovered that ancestry, that kind of made it more pressing in my mind, if that makes more sense. And so I started to look more into kind of the background of the Priesthood and Temple Ban, and then later in 2013 they came out with this essay, and so it definitely came at an interesting time for me as I was trying to wrestle with kind of this new family background and also how it relates to my faith. I ended up leaving the church later, and this was kind of the beginning. I wouldn't say it was the beginning of my faith crisis, but it was definitely the beginning of my questioning and the beginning kind of cracks in my faith. And I guess we'll talk about that more as we go on. But when I first read this essay, it was kind of a relief for me. I felt like the essay was when I read it as kind of the church saying, basically Brigham Young made a mistake. And it wasn't until after talking to other people who read it through a different lens that they felt like it was not saying that. And so I would go back and read it and like, oh, well, maybe this part here can be read in a different way. So while my initial reaction to the essay was a positive one, I felt like it kind of resolved some of my questions and things. Later on, it kind of morphed into a different experience, if that makes sense. But we can talk about that more as we go along.
Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. It's a very unique background that you have with this topic. So we're glad that you could be with us today.
Yeah.
Can I say something real quick?
Please.
So our listeners won't be able to see this life. And obviously, I'm a Black woman and Ryan is a white man. But just looking at us, you wouldn't guess that he has in history, a Black person. And looking at me, you wouldn't know that I have white. In fact, my grandfathers have white. And then I have a whole bunch of white Portuguese, ancestors.
Right.
So, and it took to my heart because when, maybe by default, I have this all accepting and all encompassing because my family, it's in my DNA. My kids are also mixed kids and whatnot, but when it's close to you, or even if you discover something and it brings it close to home, your perspective change. And so I think there is definitely something to be learned about developing empathy, even when you don't have a direct affiliation with, whoever is around you.
Yeah. Great point. All right, everybody. Are we ready to dig into an essay?
Let's do it.
All right. Great.
All right.
We'll see how long this takes because there's a lot here to unpack. Just so the listeners know, what we do is we create a Google Doc and we copy and paste the entire essay into it, and we make notes within them. So if you're familiar with making notes in Google or in Microsoft Word, you highlight the text from the essay, and then you click comment. And when you do that, it highlights the text from the essay in like a yellow or an orange. The entire essay is yellow and orange in our Google Doc. There's a lot of comments here. So what I'll do is I'm going to start reading the first few paragraphs, and my role, if I haven't explained already, is more of the moderator. So you're not going to hear from me a ton. I'm just going to make sure that the conversation moves forward. So the title of the essay is Race in the Priesthood. And Ryan, of course, right when I say I'm not going to give my thoughts, I'm going to give a thought. When you introduce yourself, you very aptly and intelligently refer to this as the Priesthood and Temple Ban. I think that it's important to call that out right from the beginning, that this was not just about the priesthood. And the essay does state that. It does call out pretty early that this was not only a priesthood ban, that there was a temple ban. So it's important to recognize that because not only was the priesthood not being given, but men and women were denied their saving ordinances in the temple. So it was a lot more than just, you can't bless the sacrament, you can't perform a baptism. So thanks for calling that out.
Do you mind if I add something to that?
Please do.
We'll see if we get through this. We haven't even started yet. But kind of echoing what Juliana said, kind of my experience was one that I was never comfortable with the priesthood and temple ban, but it wasn't before I learned that it affected me personally, or it would have affected me personally had I been alive in 1978 or previous to 1978. It was something that I could just kind of be like, oh, that makes me uncomfortable, and not really think about it. You know what I mean? And so by saying something like calling it the priesthood ban, I didn't even know that they didn't allow people with African ancestry into temples. I didn't realize that they couldn't have celestial families, because I just didn't take the time to look into it to any degree, really, because it was uncomfortable. So it's kind of we have all of us have privileges that allow us to not think about certain topics, whereas other people don't have that privilege. You know what I mean? Yeah. So when something affects you personally, you're not able to just say, you know what, I just won't think about that. You know what I mean? And so I always call it the priesthood and temple ban, so that people understand more fully what it was. As you said, that it wasn't just a priesthood ban.
Definitely. Thank you.
And I would add the word exaltation ban to that. So imagine sitting, before 1978 or in spring of 1978 in a sacrament meeting, and there's an African American family sitting in front of you. And the doctrine is, not only can the men not participate or administer in the priesthood, not only can that family not go to the temple and participate in baptisms for the vicarious baptisms or in temple ordinances, but really the implications is that family can't be exalted. That family can't be together forever. the best that they can be is entrance into the celestial kingdom as baptized people, and that's it. And the implications to that, I think, are pretty significant to our culture and our history. And so, anyway, I wanted to bring up that it's exaltation ban too.
Absolutely, which that's a big deal in the theology. So, all right, I'll read the first two paragraphs here, and Juliana, after that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the content that is read. So, the title, Race in the Priesthood. In theology and practice, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints embraces the universal human family. Latter-day Saints scripture and teachings affirm that God loves all his children and makes salvation available to all. God created the many diverse races and ethnicities and esteems them all equally. As the Book of Mormon puts it, quote, all are alike unto God, end quote. The structure and organization of the church encourage racial integration. Latter-day Saints attend church services according to the geographical boundaries of their local ward or congregation. By definition, this means that the racial, economic, and demographic composition of Mormon congregations generally mirrors that of the wider local community. The church's lay ministry also tends to facilitate integration. A black bishop may preside over a mostly white congregation. A Hispanic woman may be paired with an Asian woman to visit the homes of a racially diverse membership. Church members of different races and ethnicities regularly minister in one another's homes and serve alongside one another as teachers, as youth leaders, and in myriad other assignments in their local congregations. Such practices make the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints a thoroughly integrated faith. Julia, what were your thoughts as you read through those first few paragraphs?
So I'm going to read my notes here that I put on the side, and then if you want to ask me more pointed questions, feel free to do so. But What came to mind was that, these statements suggest that the LDS Church was always accepting of all people equally, which, in my opinion, is deceitful in and of itself. Because from the get-go, it gives, it's kind of like, it gives a comfort to, members, because this is who it's written for, that,
right.
See, look, we're not, we're not racist and we accept everyone. So to me, it sounds a little bit deceitful, since according to LDS doctrine, God only esteemed all people equally since 1978, and not even all people, people of color, I should say, and has yet to accept fully equally people of the LGBTQ community. So to me, it sounds disingenuous and dishonest to say that this is who we are, when in reality, in the real world, that is not who it is. Also quoting, the Book of Mormon, that one sentence saying, all are like unto God, yet from the same book, you have the verse in 2 Nephi 5:21 that suggests that God prefers white, fair, and delightsome people. I'll read the verse. Then it had caused the cursing to come upon them, yea, even sore cursing because of their iniquity. For behold, they had hardened their hearts against him, that they had become like unto a flint. Wherefore, as they were white and exceedingly fair and delightsome, that they might not be enticing unto my people, the Lord God did cause a skin of blackness to come upon them. Now, with that, I don't know, I'm not in the skin of a white person, so I don't know how, if it makes you feel good, or like, oh, thank heaven, I feel I fit in, But I do remember, even though, my mom joined the church when I was 4 years old. So I grew up and I was always a super Mormon, doing everything right. The church was my whole life. But I do remember feeling uneasy even as a child, and today I know that it's cognitive dissonance, which is a word that I learned, an expression I learned a couple of years ago, but I live with that, reading a verse like that, yes, made me feel, okay, so am I not good enough, despite everything I can do because my skin is dark, I'm not white, fair, and delightsome, I didn't internalize it in a way that, and I'll explain this a little bit later, because some people really internalize that, from, Cain and all that. Like, I never did that because I was fortunate to, first of all, I wasn't raised in the U.S., which I'm not saying this, in a mean way, but the experience of African Americans is very different from a Black person who may have not grown up here. So I never had to, deal with issues like that on the outside. So my family was very strong, with our African, descent and whatnot. So for that reason, it wasn't so deeply ingrained. But yes, it did make me feel uncomfortable to read something like that, and to know that was in the Book of Mormon. And of course, just like Ryan was saying, like, knowing that Black people couldn't have the priesthood wasn't comfortable, but until he knew a little bit of a deeper connection, he put it to the side. That's what I did. I shoved that. I'm like, okay, well, it doesn't quite apply to me. And something even more important, in my opinion, because it talks about the Lamanites, is me not realizing the people of Latin descent internalizing this, because people in Latin America are of all different skin color, like from super white to super Black like me. So, and to them, it's even closer because they're supposed to be descendants of the Lamanites. So how does that make them feel? And I don't know if you are all familiar with Sarah Newcomb, but she digs into that and the trauma. So to me, there's just a lot of problems, just, trying to present that, we accept all people, yet there is some major problem, even from that same book that you're pulling from, to try to show that we accept all people.
Yeah. I'm glad that you called out the descendants of the Lamanites. I say tongue in cheek, because the scripture that you read, right, isn't referring to Africans. It's referring to Native Americans.
Correct.
And
but it talks about skin color, which,
absolutely.
To me, I'm not white,
So, one question, and Juliana, maybe you don't have to be the one that answers this, but if someone wants to field this question, because this is one thing that I've heard someone in a believing space, a newer response to these scriptures is that isn't the way that God operates. That just shows Nephi's racism. That Nephi was actually the one, and the Nephite people were the ones that held these racist views, and they misunderstood the same way that perhaps Brigham misunderstood some of these promptings or thoughts that he had. So the Book of Mormon isn't showing that God is racist. It's showing that the people in the Book of Mormon were racist. How does that feel? It seems like that's a new idea for you, Juliana. I'm not sure if you've heard that before.
I've never heard that before, but it seems to me that people will go to great lengths to protect their comfort zone and to make the unacceptable acceptable. I mean, people will go to great lengths. And as you know, I mean, we could take this outside of Mormonism as well. But
sure.
So to me, that's a complete, and I have to say, I mean, I want to be respectful of, people who are true, believe that the Book of Mormon is a true book. But I have to say that for me, it makes it even worse because I don't believe the Book of Mormon is true. It makes it even worse because for these, supposedly descendants of Lamanites, to me, it's fictional. And so to put a fictitious story into reality, dismissing the culture, the real culture of these people, which have to, in order to become members, deny their own true story and culture to then accept a very traumatizing one. Can you imagine? I mean, just, I don't know. This is something I'm starting to think about the past few years as I'm trying to empathize with, because like what Ryan was saying, when like Latin Americans or the, Native Americans, they're not my people. So it's easy to distance myself. But now that I'm really trying to lean in and understand someone else's experience from their perspective, it hurts me. It hurts my core to just think about their experience.
Yeah.
Having to go through that.
Anthony, could you read the next 2 paragraphs? And I think you may have something to say because I can see you inhaling, and that's fine. You can speak. You can speak.
Unmuted. Thank you so much. Yeah. So I want to
myself.
I want to comment on a couple of those things. First thing is, I have heard that apologetic reconciliation, that the way to deal with the messiness and false or racist things that prophets of the Restoration have said is to talk about the degree of fallibility in the prophets, and that God works with what's available. And then they go further and they say, well, if today's prophets and the prophets of the Restoration are really fallible, then we need to be able to hold space for this idea that the prophets in our canonized scripture were very fallible too. And they'll point to passages in the Book of Mormon that indicate that some of the writings are probably fallible too. And so I have heard that apologetic reconciliation. The challenge is that when you just take 1 or 2 or 3 of these verses that are on this topic, you can probably proof text, which means to proof text means to impute a more contemporary meaning on a passage that was written in the past in a scriptural passage, rather than try to tease out what actually the writer was expressing. And sometimes it might be even similar to gaslighting, where you tell people this doesn't mean what you experienced it or thought that it meant. The challenge is that when you look at all of the other scriptures related to skin color, and in 3rd Nephi, where the Lamanites become righteous, and over the period of a couple of years, they become white and delightsome like the Nephites again, and so forth. When you look at all the scriptures, in the Book of Mormon on this, it seems disingenuous. It seems like it's really mental gymnastics to suggest that God had nothing to do with this. And then when you add on all the teachings of the prophets of the Restoration, even until more recent history, where interracial marriage and so forth was strongly discouraged in the Church Handbook of Instructions, there just seems to be a lot of tension in there. But I do understand that is a direction of nuanced apologetic arguments to say that this passage in the Book of Mormon wasn't about skin color. It was about other kinds of things, and maybe Nephi was a racist, like Brigham Young was a racist. Anyway, that's what I wanted to put there, and then I'll read the next paragraph or until you stop me.
Great.
Love you too, man. Despite this modern reality, for much of its history from the mid-1800s until 1978, the church did not ordain men of Black African descent to its priesthood, or allow Black men or women to participate in temple endowment or sealing ordinances. The church was established in 1830 during an era of great racial division in the United States. At the time, many people of African descent lived in slavery, and racial distinctions and prejudice were not just uncommon, but customary among white Americans. Those realities, though unfamiliar and disturbing today, influenced all aspects of people's lives, including their religion. Many Christian churches of the era, for instance, were segregated along racial lines. From the beginnings of the church, people of every race and ethnicity could be baptized and received as members. Toward the end of his life, church founder Joseph Smith openly opposed slavery. There has never been a church-wide policy of segregated congregations.
So Ryan, can you unpack that for us? There's a tone of, this is another one of the common, explanations of why there was this ban, which is about to be officially announced in the next few paragraphs. But could you unpack this a little bit of the reason of, well, of course they were racist. Everyone else was too.
Yeah. So that's true. I mean, everything that they say in this paragraph is absolutely true, that, society was definitely racist, and no one can deny that. And if you look at Mormonism especially in like the 1800s, early 1900s, they weren't particularly racist. You could definitely find organizations, institutions that were more racist than them. The problem that I see here is that they're kind of using two different arguments simultaneously. You can either say that prophets are influenced by their society, and so we should kind of take their word with a grain of salt, that, you can continue to see them as authority figures, that they give good advice, but you need to kind of go with what you feel is right, because they can be heavily influenced and be very wrong on very important issues. But I don't see the church saying that, you know what I mean? I see them using that argument to kind of explain away the past, but if you're going to use that to explain away the past, you have to do that for the present as well. So I often hear kind of the argument that, the past, what's the phrase that the past is a foreign land, so we do things differently there. Right. So that's absolutely true. Like, we can't use presentism to say that certain figures in the past were exceptionally racist because we're comparing that to today. But you can't do that with prophets who claim that they aren't influenced by society, if that makes sense. And so I'm kind of uncomfortable with this paragraph because of that you kind of have to pick your poison. You have to say either, you get what I'm saying, the two scenarios there. So, also just kind of the very last sentence there that says that there's never been a policy of segregated congregations. That is a true statement, that they never had black LDS wards and white LDS wards. However, they also actively didn't preach the gospel to countries that were overrepresented with African descent. They wouldn't go into black neighborhoods. And it wasn't just like a rogue mission president or something. These were instructions from the top. And you can look at that in letters and different things to where you can see that the church was actively not preaching to African Americans. And so it's like, sure, they didn't have segregated congregations, but that's not the full story. Yeah. And so this is one of those examples where you can kind of skim through this and, oh, yeah, that sounds good. But when you look into the details, it's not quite as good as they're making it seem. And so that was kind of my experience with just this whole topic. Superficially, you can kind of not really comfortable, whatever, moving on. But once you dig deeper, it's very evident that there are things here that you need to deal with. You know what I mean? That These are not things that you can just kind of swipe away.
Yeah, very true. Ryan, would you mind reading the next two paragraphs? Oh, no, Anthony, no. Go ahead.
All right. Yeah, so this was a chink in my shelf because they selectively parsed this, kind of like an attorney will selectively parse something to lead the reader to believe something while glossing over the details.
Relying on their ignorance of the topic.
Correct. And so there's two things that I would share. First of all, they say there was never a church-wide policy of segregated congregations, but there was local segregation, and the brother approved of it. And they say toward the end of his life, Joseph Smith openly opposed slavery. But in Doctrine and Covenants, section 134 is a canonized proclamation from 1835 in Kirtland, Ohio. And it was part of the very first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, which replaced the Book of Commandments in 1835. And verse 12 of Doctrine and Covenants 134 reads, "We believe it just to preach the gospel to the nations of the earth and warn the righteous to save themselves from the corruption of the world. But we do not believe it right to interfere with bondservants, neither preach the gospel to nor baptize them contrary to the will and wish of their masters, nor to meddle with or influence with them in the least to cause them to be dissatisfied with their situations in this life, thereby jeopardizing the lives of men. Such interference we believe to be unlawful and unjust and dangerous to the peace of every government, allowing human beings to be held in servitude. Now, the apologists will say, well, this is to make sure that those who were slaves, didn't get beaten more or something like that. But, there are states in the country, like the state of Massachusetts, didn't prohibit interracial marriage, and slavery wasn't universally practiced. So like Ryan was mentioning, prophets you would think would be ahead of the time. I'd also mention a couple things for the reader. I'm not going to go through all of these, or for the listener, you could go to Mormon Think and look at the review of this essay. But there are several examples where the brethren did support local segregation, including presidents of the church like Heber J. Grant, David O. McKay, and J. Reuben Clark were their counselors. There's a book written by Lester Bush that has a letter from them with regard to localized segregation. There's one instance which is really interesting in as late as 1965. BYU President Wilkinson wrote in his journal that Harold B. Lee, who would I think have been a senior member of the Quorum of the 12 at the time in 1965, was protesting vigorously over our having given a scholarship at the BYU to a Negro student from Africa. Brother Lee holds the traditional belief as revealed in the Old Testament that races ought to be kept together and that there is danger in trying to integrate them on the BYU campus. So there are several examples where the brethren supported localized segregation. And again, I think it's not uncommon, at least my experience when I read the essays, and in particular this one, the material was difficult, but what was even more difficult is it seemed like there was misdirection, a lack of intellectual integrity when they would selectively parse things, so the readers who didn't go more in depth missed out.
Yeah.
So in any event. So did you say it was my turn? Is it Juliana's turn? I can't remember.
I could just be the reader. You guys are giving all the good stuff. I can just be the audiobook.
Let's do it.
All right. I'll make sure I've got plenty of water. All right. So here's the next two paragraphs. During the first 2 decades of the church's existence, a few black men were ordained to the priesthood. One of these men, Elijah Abel, also participated in temple ceremonies in Kirtland, Ohio, and was later baptized as proxy for deceased relatives in Nauvoo, Illinois. There is no reliable evidence that any black men were denied the priesthood during Joseph Smith's lifetime. In a private church council 3 years after Joseph Smith's death, Brigham Young praised Q. Walker Lewis, a black man who had been ordained to the priesthood, saying, quote, "We have one of the best elders in Africa," end quote. In 1852, President Brigham Young publicly announced that men of black African descent could no longer be ordained to the priesthood, though thereafter blacks continued to join the church through baptism and receiving the gift of the Holy Ghost. Following the death of Brigham Young, subsequent church presidents restricted blacks from receiving the temple endowment or being married in the temple. Over time, church leaders and members advanced many theories to explain the priesthood and temple restrictions. None of these explanations is accepted today as the official doctrine of the church. Okay, hold on a second. So those 2 paragraphs seem to take a big old fat leap of look at the first two decades of the church. There's Elijah Abel, there's Q. Walker Lewis, there's even Brigham Young praising Q. Walker Lewis, that he's one of the best elders. And then the next sentence, Brigham Young bans it. What is going on there? Does anyone want to jump in? I know, Juliana, you had a note on this paragraph. It seems a little like what just happened?
Again, I mean, the way this whole essay is written, it's so apologetic. It's so like, look, they weren't that bad. Like this first paragraph, that's what it is. There is 2 black men, 2. How many black people lived, during that time? But then there's like these 2, like it's a huge thing that were accepted in the community. And look what Brigham Young says about this one, like, don't do that. Like, don't. It makes to me, it makes the reader look like a child, or, you take this one sentence when there is books of and paragraphs and discourses that describes his racism. Yet you take this one sentence, try to make it sound like he wasn't that bad, because he praised this one man, so he couldn't be that bad. But anyways, like you say, then there's this big, huge leap into, then he bans, black people from African descent to have the priesthood, and there is no explanation in between. It's like, what? And of course, later on we have all these theories about Cain and whatnot, but it's just so discombobulated the way it's presented, trying to look good while presenting really detrimental information and hurtful information. So, and my point was the same as, both of our Brian and Anthony, that you had no problem separating yourself religiously, stating, none of the churches are true out there. We have the true church and we'll take the persecution for it. And yet here you have an opportunity to not follow mainstream and also be different, yet you don't want to. Why? Because clearly you're racist, because if you are so enlightened, you should know better, because you will, as we see, change later. So why not prior, since you should be the most enlightened on earth at the time? And like you said, not everyone in the U.S., not every state was accepting these things. You could have been one of the few who was ahead of its time, So to me, this just confirms everything else that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
big
absolutely.
Problems.
It's interesting what you
they're
mentioned.
Not inspired, basically.
Sure. In 1852, this paragraph talks about, this is when Brigham Young publicly announced. So this is the Black African descent could no longer be ordained to the priesthood. So this is the beginning of that ban. In 1852, the church also announces that it publicly practices polygamy.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the arguments or apologetic responses for the ban is the church had to survive. And in order to survive in America at that time, they could not be seen as race mixers. They could not be seen as overly accepting of persons of color, because the church would be destroyed. Yet in the same exact year,
then what about polygamy? It's the
right.
Same kind of thing. It's like you pick and choose what you're going to fight for and stand for, even though the society isn't for it, such as what you believe, because people didn't believe what you believed, and polygamy, which people rejected that too. So it's a choice. It's a choice.
Right.
To be racist. It's a choice.
That flies in the face. And I'm taking a few things from Dr. Paul Reeve that I'm sure he will come up here, but he's a believing member of the church, historian, that has a lot of great insights on this topic. And he quotes in response to that argument that the church couldn't embrace black people because they would have been destroyed in that time period of America. He quotes the scripture that no unhallowed hand could, a better scriptorian can finish that quote, but no unhallowed hand can stop the work from progressing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if that apology or that explanation is true, then yes, it could.
And imagine,
go ahead, Ryan.
Imagine how that argument would sound today. Like if the Mormon Church as an institution had stood up against slavery beginning in the mid 1800s. Imagine how useful that would be in converting people today. If they could say, we have prophets, and prophets can see through kind of the muddled society, and they can see what is moral, what is right. And here's examples right here. Mm-hmm. In the 1850s, Brigham Young said that everyone is equal in God's eyes and that we shouldn't have slavery, and they were they were abolitionists. And, imagine how many people would be joining the church if the institution could use that as an argument. So I think that's probably true for that day, that maybe gained them some points, especially with Southern people that came from the Southern states in Utah. But if we're talking about the church's survival as a whole, that's absolutely untrue. it would be a very good selling point to say, these are all the examples that we have of prophets doing what prophets are supposed to do.
And to illustrate that, they use kind of the word of wisdom that way. See that, way back when they knew this wasn't good for you. I mean, they could have done the same thing with seeing ahead of the times, which you'd think that's what a prophet's for, is that he sees before the rest of the world. And here it seems to be backward, not always, but a lot of times.
And so one of the problems that I have, with kind of nuanced Mormonism, I think it's great that they are trying to push it beyond kind of the more racist past and say things like, oh, maybe it wasn't God that was racist, it was Nephi, and kind of that's bringing it to a more palatable, more acceptable level. The problem is you have to, at the same time, acknowledge what was taught in the past. Otherwise, it's gaslighting, and it's further hurting people if you don't acknowledge that is not what has been taught for the past 200 years. In fact, the exact opposite was taught. You know what I mean? So you have to acknowledge that. You have to acknowledge what was taught and specifically disavow it. And we'll see repeatedly throughout this essay where they have the chance to be very specific, be very explicit, and they choose to not do that. And it's hurtful because they're doing this to, in my view, this is my own opinion, they're doing this to save the testimony of people who grew up with racist theology. They're doing it to keep them comfortable at the expense of people who are hurting and who have been hurt for decades because of these doctrines. And I see that as shameful. That might kind of sound like a strong word, but I think it is, to keep people comfortable in racism at the expense of people who are hurting. I think that is not a very Christ-like thing to do.
Yeah, I think it was President Hinckley didn't he wrote a book about standing for something or something like that?
Exactly.
Yep.
So I have a couple comments on this paragraph. The first of all is this is the first time I had ever heard of Elijah Abel. And they just kind of gloss over this a little bit and say he got the priesthood, he got the temple ceremonies to the extent that they existed in Kirtland, and he was able to do proxy baptisms in Nauvoo. There's so much more to that story that just totally gets glossed over here. He was ordained to the third quorum of the 70. He served 3 missions for the church, like a mission president kind of person. Okay. He was influential. Imagine being Elijah Abel, having served missions of the church, being in the third quorum of the 70, and while you're living, Brigham Young says, Utah is a legal slave territory. Slavery is God ordained. And now we're going to ban blacks from having the priesthood. And I mean, we'll get into more of that when we talk about Brigham Young's 1852 speech. The other thing that Ryan brought up in the notes is later Joseph F. Smith indicated that Elijah Abel's ordination was done in error and tried to have the records erased from the history. And Dr. Reeve, that we've been referring to, has somewhat recently, I think it was maybe last year, written about this and provided evidence that President Joseph F. Smith knowingly was lying, that he was completely aware that Elijah Abel's ordination was totally legit. His missions were legit. His temple ordinances in Kirtland and participating in proxy baptisms were legit. So just in these paragraphs, it's pretty defeating to read this and say, like Ryan saying, they're trying to address these issues without going too much into depth so they can allow a spectrum of belief on these topics, as opposed to just standing for something and saying, look, blacks received the priesthood, not just the priesthood, but were the equivalent of like mission presidents and in the third quorum of the 70. And there was never a revelation for the ban. And then Brigham Young decided to legalize slavery and ban blacks from the priesthood, the temple, and exaltation.
I think some of the pushback there would be that, this is an essay for the entire church, so they have to keep it simple. So there's, only so much that they can throw in there without making it too dense. But even, and that is true, but even with that, you can't be so simple that you are misleading. And I think it's misleading to bring up Elijah Abel as like this example of how he was accepted in the church and things like that, without adding the context of Joseph F. Smith trying to say later on in 1908 that he was incorrectly given the priesthood and that was a mistake, and him actively taking his records, or his priesthood ordination out of the records of the church. So, and that happens all throughout this essay, that they say something really simple that is so devoid of context that it makes it almost inaccurate, if that makes sense. That they had a responsibility to show more of the context, and they chose not to.
I'm going to read the next 2 paragraphs, and then Juliana will tee you up. So pay attention. We need your thoughts. Okay, here we go.
Okay.
The Church in an American Racial Culture. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was restored amidst a highly contentious racial culture in which whites were afforded great privilege. They got the word privilege in there. Editorial, sorry. In 1790, the U.S. Congress limited citizenship to free white persons. Over the next half-century, issues of race divided the country. While slave labor was legal in the more agrarian South, it was eventually banned in the more urbanized North. Even so, racial discrimination was widespread in the North as well as the South, and many states implemented laws banning interracial marriage. In 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that blacks possessed, quote, no right with which the white man was bound to respect, end quote. A generation after the Civil War, 1861 to 65, a generation after the Civil War led to the end of slavery in the United States. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities for blacks and whites were constitutional, a decision that legalized a host of public color barriers until the court reversed itself in 1954. Not until 1967 did the court strike down laws forbidding interracial marriage. In 1850, the U.S. Congress created Utah Territory, and the U.S. President appointed Brigham Young to the position of territorial governor. Southerners who had converted to the church and migrated to Utah with their slaves raised the question of slavery's legal status in the territory. In 2 speeches delivered before the Utah Territorial Legislature in January and February 1852, Brigham Young announced a policy restricting men of black African descent from priesthood ordination. At the same time, Brigham Young said that at some future day, black church members would, quote, have all the privilege and more, end quote, enjoyed by other members. Okay. Juliana, your thoughts.
Okay, first I have to, am I on mute?
No, you're good. We can hear you.
Oh, okay, sorry. I have to say that you might get in trouble here because I'm not African American, right? So my experience is different. And I do like to say that I don't pretend ever that my experience is close, even close to African Americans, which maybe on the next one we should have a black person who is, really African American. People see me as a black person, right? When you see me on the street. And of course, this relates to me, but it relates to me on a different level. I'm also not an expert in American history, which, I've studied, I went to Brigham University and, I did, take, history and learn a lot of things in college, not since I'm a little girl and, as far as American history and all the racial tensions and whatnot. And now I'm also learning more because of everything that's happening. My kids are mixed, so their father's white, and, so they're American on their dad's side, right? But in America, they're black and they would be seen as African American when in reality they're not really, because I'm not American. So it's very confusing, the things we have to navigate. That said, just to bring it back to what has already been said before, like clearly they were places where people were already against what was happening. And so the fact that the church didn't take that position earlier on is really questionable. I also want to come back a little bit to what was said earlier, about how things are being interpreted, because at the end of the day, it almost doesn't matter how things are interpreted, because the experience that people have reading the things that are presented by the church and internalizing is what matters. And the fact that it has hurt people from the beginning and continues to hurt people is where the light should be shed on, and where people avoid to put a light on. I'm about to release a podcast episode with Spencer Nugent. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him, but his experience
He's a friend of mine.
Awesome. But his experience is something else. As you were talking earlier about, I think it was Ryan, or I think it was Anthony, about how it would feel like, to have a family of African Americans sitting in front of you, knowing that, they couldn't. That was them. In Jamaica, when his parents joined the church, his father waiting outside of the priesthood meeting room because he couldn't be inside. I mean, I can't even understand that type of faith, and the fact that he would still want to be a part of this. I mean, I guess he got, a lot of good experiences and good things being a part of it. But that, to me, that alone would have kept me out of even wanting to join a church like that, right? And the fact that, Spencer and his brother and sister had, they lived this from, he was born in the church in Jamaica, and he lived this, like being an outsider, being, I don't even understand, like my mind, I cannot wrap my mind around that. I was born in 1976, so a couple of years before, the ban was lifted. So when I was little, I had no idea. And I didn't even know about anything, because of course, when you're in a foreign country, you don't get that information. Like I didn't know any of this. I mean, some of the stuff I didn't know until a few years ago. I learned about, all these speeches from Brigham Young and whatnot on my mission, because there were, anti-Mormon on Temple Square handing out, literature about what the former prophet had said. I walked in my mission president's, office saying, what is this? What is this? I wrote to the first presidency. I wrote to President Hinckley directly with, some of these, maybe I'm ahead a little bit, but part of the speech from, Brigham Young or McConkie saying super racist stuff. Like I wrote a letter to the first presidency as a missionary with the quotes attached saying, what is this? And you can ask me later what was the answer. But I mean, so basically my point is, it almost doesn't matter how you want to interpret what was said. And it's the experience of the people on the ground that you need to pay attention to and how it affects them. There's something else that Ryan mentioned earlier, saying that, they're using the oppression of some to keep the comfort of others. That's exactly what Spencer Nugent said. Like, in fact, his analogy was, the comfort blanket of the privilege is made of the oppression of others. Do you realize that? Your comforting blanket is made of the oppression of others. It's like this quilt of all these, communities and people who are down, trodden, and it creates your comfort. And so people have to take that in and dissect that and see how we can remove it, and create a different blanket. So anyways, those were my thoughts. And I don't have any more to add. Maybe Anthony does, like, as far as like history and what's going on in the U.S. I mean, these are things that I'm still learning. Again, I know about the history, but not on the level that, you guys do. So.
Well, let's go to, thank you, Juliana. Anthony, let's go to you, because there's an often referred to footnote that we just got to, that I understand you have a history with. Can you explain a little bit about what the end of this paragraph in footnote number 9 is all about?
Yeah, so here I am, the evening of April 29th, 2016, reading this essay, learning about Elijah Abel, reading here where they're calling things taught as doctrine, calling them theories, figuring out so there's footnote 9 seems to me, it says at the same time President Young said at some future day black church members would have, quote, all the privilege and more, unquote, enjoyed by other members, led me to believe that I've never heard about this. Like, Brigham Young prophesied that 1978 would happen, So I'm reading this, and so I go to footnote number 9 to read Brigham Young's speeches. There's 2 speeches. One is the announcement of legalized slavery, and then I read this speech from the 5th of February, 1852, which Brigham Young gave to the legislature the very day after Utah was officially and legally a slave territory, the only one in the West, by the way. I read this speech from Brigham Young, and it wasn't a Brigham Young that I ever knew. It wasn't a history that I ever knew. And when I read the speech, I came to the conclusion that the essay was just intellectually dishonest, but it was blatantly dishonest in trying to mislead the reader to believe that Brigham Young was prophesying and would have supported a lift of the ban in 1978, because this partial phrase is pulled out of a context suggesting that it might be not until the end of the millennium, after the restitution of all things, after all white people after all the resurrections, after all white people first have the opportunity to receive the priesthood, at that time, then blacks would receive the opportunity to receive the priesthood. And not only that the curse would be lifted from them. And he talks about the color of their skin, and you can see it on their face and so forth, that would change too. And as I was reading this, it seemed like President Young was saying that they would become white when they receive the priesthood. So in any event, I think for the listener, even though this speech is a little bit clunky, and that we're going to read it and then talk about it, it was critical to me. This speech is when I came to the realization or recognition that the leaders of the church, the brethren, not just Brigham Young, but from Brigham Young until 1978, they harmed people in the name of God. They didn't have discernment. They didn't have the ability to discern between their own prejudices and biases and actual inspiration from God, which meant that spiritual experiences for them weren't reliable witnesses of truth, because they testified of and bore testimony and called doctrine the ban. And the things that are referred to as theories, they testified of with spiritual experiences. And as I read this speech, I recognized that not only had spiritual experiences failed them as reliable divine witnesses of truth, that there were experiences in my life where my spiritual experiences, while real, they failed as reliable divine witnesses of truth. So,
do you mind if I add a quick context before you start reading this?
Please, Ryan.
So this is you mentioned, I think, that this was a legislative session where they were talking about whether Utah should allow slavery or not. So I believe it was right before Brigham Young spoke, either the day before or earlier in this day, where Orson Pratt, who was, I believe, an apostle at the time, he spoke about how this would be a shameful thing to do. He spoke about how not only should black people not be in slavery, but he argued that they should have the right to vote. He said that if passed, this would, I believe the quote is, it would make even the angels in heaven blush. So to use the excuse that, Brigham Young was just a product of his time, Orson Pratt was a product of his time as well. And yet he was able to see through that and to see that this is wrong. And that, I think it's amazing that he was able to say that in front of Brigham Young, which I'm sure was an intimidating figure. So just to kind of push back against people who may say, he's just a product of his time. He had no other choice. He had the agency to choose something else. And Orson Pratt gives an excellent example of someone that did that.
So I want to add two more things before we get into Allan reading this speech for us. The first is that one more recent apologetic reconciliation is to suggest that Brigham Young really wasn't racist, and the scribes who wrote down his talks and speeches, like, inserted their own material into it. So I've seen that, which is total BS, because this speech and other racist speeches of Brigham Young were printed, like, in the Deseret News. They were publicly printed, and Brigham Young never said that he was misquoted. The people who were at these speeches never said that they were misquoted. So that's just a total BS apologetic reconciliation to suggest that this
basically it wasn't fake news.
Right, yeah, right. It was not fake news. So, and then the second thing I would mention is that the Strangites gave blacks the priesthood in 1849, and this is 1852. And Emma's church and Joseph Smith III's church, which is now Community of Christ, they gave blacks the priesthood in 1886. So they were our cousins in the Restoration and movement of the Strangites and the RLDS, or Community of Christ. Like, they were in the struggle with these things too, but their reaction was very different than what you'll hear in this speech from Brigham Young.
We were lucky enough to get permission from Jonathan Streeter from the YouTube channel Thinker of Thoughts to read, or rather play, his reading of this same exact speech. Jonathan has a great voice for dictation, and also went through the speech, added punctuation, and read this speech in a way that I was not able to reproduce without practicing at all. So thank you, Jonathan. And here is his reading of this 1852 speech on slavery in the Utah legislature by Brigham Young.
I rise to make a few remarks. The items before the House I do not understand. The principle of slavery I understand. At least I have self-confidence enough and confidence enough in God to believe I do. I believe still further that a great many others understand it as I do. A great portion of this community have been instructed and have applied their minds to it, and as far as they have, they agree precisely in the principles of slavery. My remarks in the first place will be upon the cause of the introduction of slavery. Long ago, Mama Eve, our good old Mother Eve, partook of the forbidden fruit, and this made a slave of her. Adam hated very much to have her taken out of the Garden of Eden, and now our old daddy says, I believe I will eat of the fruit and become a slave too. This was the first introduction of slavery upon this earth, and there have been not a son or daughter of Adam from that day to this, but what were slaves in the true sense of the word. That slavery will continue until there is a people raised up upon the face of the earth who will contend for righteous principles, who will not only believe in but operate with every power and faculty given to them to help to establish the kingdom of God, to overcome the devil and drive him from the earth. Then will this curse be removed. This was the starting point of slavery. Again, after Adam and Eve partook of the curse, we find they had two sons, Cain and Abel. But which was the oldest, I cannot positively say, but this I know. Cain was given more to evil practices than Abel. But whether he was the oldest or not matters not to me. Adam was commanded to sacrifice and offer up his offerings unto God that placed him into the Garden of Eden. Through the faith and obedience of Abel to his heavenly Father, Cain became jealous of him, and he laid a plan to obtain all his flocks. For through his perfect obedience to Father, he obtained more blessings than Cain. Consequently, he took it into his heart to put Abel out of his mortal existence. After the deed was done, the Lord inquired to Abel and made Cain own what he had done with him. Now says the grandfather, I will not destroy the seed of Michael and his wife, and Cain, I will not kill you, nor suffer anyone to kill you, but I will put a mark upon you. What is that mark? You will see it on the countenance of every African you ever did see upon the face of the earth, or ever will see. Now I tell you what I know. When the mark was put upon Cain, Abel's children was in all probability young. And the Lord told Cain that he should not receive the blessings of the priesthood, nor his seed, until the last of the posterity of Abel had received the priesthood, until the redemption of the earth. If there never was a prophet or apostle of Jesus Christ spoke it before, I tell you, this people that are commonly called Negroes are the children of old Cain. I know they are. I know that they cannot bear rule in the priesthood, for the curse on them was to remain upon them until the residue of the posterity of Michael and his wife received the blessings the seed of Cain would have received had they not been cursed, and hold the keys of the priesthood until the times of the restitution shall come, and the curse be wiped off from the earth and from Michael's seed. Then Cain's seed will be had in remembrance, and the time come when that curse should be wiped off. Now then, in the kingdom of God on earth, a man who has the African blood in him cannot hold one jot nor tittle of priesthood. Why? Because they are the true eternal principles the Lord Almighty has ordained. And who can help it? Men cannot. The angels cannot, and all the powers of earth and hell cannot take it off. But thus saith the eternal, I am what I am. I take it off at my pleasure, and not one particle of power can that posterity of Cain have, until the time comes he says he will have it taken away. That time will come when they will have the privilege of all we have the privilege of, and more. In the kingdom of God on earth, the Africans cannot hold one particle of power in government. The subjects, the rightful servants of the residue of the children of Adam, and the residue of the children through the benign influence of the Spirit of the Lord, have the privilege of seeing to the posterity of Cain. Inasmuch as it is the Lord's will, they should receive the Spirit of God by baptism, and that is the end of their privilege. And there is not power on earth to give them any more power. You talk of the dark skin. I never saw a white man on earth. I have seen persons whose hair came pretty nigh being white, but to talk about white skins, it is something entirely unknown. Though some skins are fairer than others, look at the black eye and the jet black hair we often see upon men and women who are called white. There is no such thing as white folks. We are the children of Adam who receive the blessings, and that is enough for us if we are not quite white. But let me tell you further. Let my seed mingle with the seed of Cain. That brings the curse upon me and upon my generations. We will reap the same rewards with Cain. In the priesthood I will tell you what it will do. Were the children of God to mingle their seed with the seed of Cain, it would not only bring the curse of being deprived of the power of the priesthood upon themselves, but they entail it upon their children after them, and they cannot get rid of it. If a man in an unguarded moment should commit such a transgression, if he would walk up and say, cut off my head, and kill man, woman, and child, it would do a great deal towards atoning for the sin. Would this be a curse to them? No. It would be a blessing to them. It would do them good that they might be saved with their brethren. A man would shudder should they hear us talk about killing folk, but it is one of the greatest blessings to kill them, although the true principles of it are not understood. I will add one more thing. It is not in the power of a man on the face of the earth to take more life than he can give. That is a proper son of Adam. How many times have I heard it said, and how many times has it been reiterated in my ears and in yours, that to take a life is to take what you cannot give? This is perfect nonsense. What do I do by taking a man's head off after he is condemned by the law? I put an end to the existence of the mortal tabernacle, but the life still remains. The body and the spirit is only separated. This is all that can be done by any mortal man upon the face of the earth. Can I give that life? I can. I can make as good tabernacles as any other man. If you do not believe it, go and look at my children. Therefore, that saying is nonsense. We form the tabernacle for the eternal spirit or life that comes from God. We can only put an end to the existence of that tabernacle, and this is the principle of sacrifice. What was the cause of the ancients drawing up hundreds and thousands of bullocks and heifers and lambs and doves and almost every other creature around them, of which they took the best and the fattest and offered them up as sacrifices unto the Lord? Was it not for the remission of the sins of the people? We read also in the New Testament that a man was sacrificed for the sins of the people. If he had not, you and I could have had no remission of sins. It is the greatest blessing that could come to some men to shed their blood on the ground and let it come up before the Lord as an atonement. You nor I cannot take any more life than we can give. Again to the subject before us. As to the men bearing rule, not one of the children of old Cain have one particle of right to bear rule in government affairs from their own transgressions, and I cannot help it. And should you or I bear rule, we ought to do it with dignity and honor before God. I am as much opposed to the principle of slavery as any man. In the present acceptation or usage of the term, it is abused. I am opposed to abusing that which God has decreed, to take a blessing and make a curse of it. It is a great blessing to the seed of Adam to have the seed of Cain for servants, but those they serve should use them with all the heart and feeling as they would use their own children, and their compassion should reach over them and around about them, and treat them as kindly and with that humane feeling necessary to be shown to all mortal beings of the human species. Under these circumstances, their blessings in life are greater in proportion than those who have to provide the bread and dinner for them. We know there is a portion of inhabitants of the earth who dwell in Asia that are Negroes, and said to be Jews. The blood of Judah has not only mingled almost with all nations, but also with the blood of Cain, and they have mingled their seeds together. These Negro Jews may keep up all the outer ordinances of the Jewish religion. They may have their sacrifices, and they may perform all the religious ceremonies any people on earth could perform. But let me tell you that the day they consented to mingle their seed with Canaan, the priesthood was taken away from Judah, and that portion of Judah's seed will never get any rule or blessings of the priesthood until Cain gets it. Let this church, which is called the kingdom of God on the earth, we will summon the first presidency, the 12, the high council, the bishopric, and all the elders of Israel. Suppose we summon them to appear here, and here declare that it is right to mingle our seed with the black race of Cain, that they shall come in with us and be partakers with us of all the blessings God has given to us. On that very day and hour we should do so, the priesthood is taken from this church and kingdom, and God leave us to our fate. The moment we consent to mingle with the seed of Cain, the church must go to destruction. We should receive the curse which has been placed upon the seed of Cain, and never more be numbered with the children of Adam who are heirs to the priesthood, until that curse be removed. Therefore, I will not consent for one moment to have an African dictate to me or any brethren with regard to church or state government. I may vary in my views from others, and they may think I'm foolish in the things I have spoken, and think that they know more than I do. But I know more than they do. If the Africans cannot bear rule in the Church of God, what business have they to bear rule in the state and government affairs of this territory or any others? If the government affairs of states and territories and kingdoms by right God should govern, he should rule over nations and control kings. If we suffer the devil to rule over us, we shall not accomplish any good. I want the Lord to rule and be our governor and dictator. We are the boys to execute. I shall not consent for a moment to give way to a Gentile spirit of contention, which is the cause of angry difference to the alienation of every good feeling. It is for you and I to take a course, to bind our feelings together in an everlasting bond of union, inasmuch as we love the Lord, which we ought to do more than selves. Consequently, I will not consent for a moment to have the children of Cain rule me nor my brethren. No, it is not right. But, say some, is there anything of this kind in the Constitution the United States has given us? If you will allow me the privilege of telling right out, it is none of their damn business what we do or say here. For what we do, it is for them to sanction, and then for us to say what we like about it. It is written right out in the Constitution that every free white male inhabitant above the age of 21 years, etc. My mind is the same today as when we were poring over that Constitution. Any light upon the subject is the same. My judgment is the same, only a little more so. Perhaps I have said enough upon this subject. I have given you the true principles and doctrine. No man can vote for me or my brethren in this territory who has not the privilege of acting in church affairs. Every man and woman and child in this territory are citizens. To say contrary is all nonsense to me. The Indians are citizens, the Africans are citizens, and the Jews that come from Asia, that are most entirely of the blood of Cain. It is our duty to take of them and administer to them in all acts of humanity and kindness. They shall have the right of citizenship, but shall not have the right to dictate in church and state matters. The abolitionists of the East have caressed them, and their whole argument are calculated to darken counsel, as it was here yesterday. As for our bills passing, we may lay the foundation. For what? For men to come here from Africa or elsewhere by hundreds of thousands? When these men come here from the islands, are they going to hold offices in government? No. It is for men who understand the knowledge of government affairs to hold such offices, and on the other to make provisions for them to plow and to reap, and enjoy all that human beings can enjoy, and we protect them in it. Do we know how to ameliorate the condition of these people? We do. Suppose that 5,000 of them come from the Pacific Islands and 10 or 15,000 from Japan or from China. Not one soul of them would know how to vote for a government officer. They, therefore, ought not, in the first thing, to have anything to do in government affairs. What the Gentiles are doing, we are consenting to do. What we are trying to do today is to make the Negro equal with us in all our privilege. My voice shall be against all the day long. I shall not consent for one moment. I will call them a council. I say I will not consent for one moment for you to lay a plan to bring a curse upon this people. It shall not be while I am here.
So, first of all, it's interesting to see that the tradition of white people ruling has remained in the church. I mean, look at the first presidency, and no matter how they try to be like, we're so international, we're so, welcoming and this and that, just look at the top leadership and who's there and has always been there, white male. So that's number one. Number two, it's baffling to see what happens when there is no scientific method applied to thinking. I mean, to me, it's just overt ignorance, folklore mixed with cold thinking. I mean, it's just crazy. Like, I mean, not just because, it's written the way it's written, but the thoughts that are coming through, and you add the devil and angels, and I mean, I don't know. It's just beyond me. And then on a funny note, I would have liked to see Brigham Young's face in heaven when he finds out he comes from Africa, because it's the cradle of humanity. And on a more serious note, it is very sad, because habits die hard, and traditions and culture, that it has trickled down. And again, as I haven't myself, I mean, I had heard of, people, and I know people who've said, who are Black, either were adopted or, lived in Utah or some very heavily Mormon place, that when they go to heaven, they would turn white, and they were kind of holding on to that thought. I'm like, I mean, personally, I'm very, very glad that I was born where I was born, and I received the culture that I received. My African grandmother on my mother's side is a queen of a village, in Africa, that, so I have very strong sense of belonging and my roots and everything else. And I feel deeply for people who don't have that. And the stories that they're told, especially within the LDS faith, where, with a smile and a nod and a pat, I'm sorry, you just, not good enough, or I'm sorry that you're going to have to wait, to be in heaven to look better. Like, I don't care. Like, I don't, my family is so multicultural. Like you can't see it. I have white in me. So it's that no, I don't want to be white when I go to heaven. I like the way I look. I like my dark skin, and to be told stuff like that, it's so damaging. It's just so deeply damaging. And here you clearly see where it comes from. There is no denying it. Yeah. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you. Ryan, Anthony, anything on this speech?
Sure. Just to piggyback on what Juliana said, imagine reading this and being someone who is Black or has any African ancestry, and being a believer in Mormonism, believing that the prophet speaks for God. And then imagine reading what we just read, and what that, like Juliana said, what that does to your identity, to your feeling of self-worth. And I did not understand that at all until I listened to a podcast with Dustin Jones, who is a African American, and he talked about he was actually raised in the post 1978 church, but he still struggled with identity and feeling of self-worth, and feeling like he has to do extra to be, righteous because of these folklore and these racist teachings that were taught as if it came from the mouth of God. And so, kind of the same kind of thing. You can be white and read this and just be like, oh, that's uncomfortable. Close the book. I don't want to read that. You know what I mean? But if you are someone that is of African descent, you read this and you don't have the privilege of closing it and putting it away. It's talking about who you are as an individual. And I think that the Mormon community, I'll add myself in, even though I've left the church, I still feel like I'm part of that community. We need to confront our history. We need to not pretend that this stuff does not exist. We have to confront it. We have to say it was said, and we have to say that it was wrong. Specifically, not just say racism is bad, let's all get along. We have to say those things that Brigham Young said were wrong. They were not of God. This is not, and you can't just say this is not official doctrine. That's not the same as saying it's wrong. You have to say it is wrong. That those things that he said were not of God, because that is the only way that you detangle that from people's identity, by saying that it was not of God. And that's my frustration with this essay as a whole. It does not say that. It says racism is bad. That's a good thing to say, but it falls well short of people who are hungering, who are just struggling with making sense of all of this within their faith. And I think that is very sad, personally. And
yeah. So Ryan brought up Dustin. Oh, go ahead, Juliana.
Sorry, if I may say real quick, just he mentioned Dustin Jones, sharing his experience. And like I said, I'm about to release a podcast with Spencer Nugent, and that's his experience as well. And I know there are many out there who have internalized these things, are still hurting to this day, are trying to, for those who are working with it, trying to get over the trauma. But as you know, there's still a lot of, Black members and African American members and African members, and they are carrying that burden of trying to, personally, I hope they'll, whatever. I'm not here to say what people should do, but it remains basically that issue is still well and alive. And from the perspective of someone who is of color, it's a heavy one to carry.
Yeah, Ryan brought up Dustin Jones, and I hope that I'm not misremembering that it was Spencer instead of Dustin. But I think in Dustin's Mormon Stories interview, he shared his experience that when he got his patriarchal blessing, the patriarch didn't name what tribe he was from.
That was him, yeah.
Yeah, and so then he goes back and tries to figure it out and asks for an actual second patriarchal blessing or like an update, so like his tribe could be named. And his patriarch said, well, you're not a tribe, you're a descendant of Cain. So this doctrine, whether you call it small d or large d doctrine, this doctrine that Brigham Young is teaching here with regard to Cain and the mark of the curse and so forth, it didn't just perpetuate to 1978 and then end. Like decades after 1978, we have patriarchs in the church that continue to perpetuate some of this doctrine, because in patriarchal blessings, they will not name a tribe, or they will say you're adopted into the house of Israel because you're actually a lineal descendant of Cain. Like Juliana mentioned science, like do a DNA test and see that we all came from Africa, right? So in any event, it perpetuates. So I hope you don't mind. I have a couple of things. So before I read this talk or this speech, like Brigham Young was my prophet. And then I read that, in the essay that Brigham Young, I was led to believe by this partial quote that they take out of context and put in the essay to say, oh, it's all fine because Brigham Young prophesied that 1978 would happen. And then I read the speech, and it's a tough speech. I guess narcissists have a hard time putting sentences together. And certainly it looks like to be the case with Brigham Young here. But there's a few things that he says here that I think that I want to tease out before we go on. The first thing is he makes clear that the skin color is a mark from God. Of course, he wouldn't have known DNA and things like that. The second thing is he talks about when Cain kills Abel, Abel probably leaves behind seed or children. And so later in the speech, when he says that blacks can't hold the priesthood until all of the residual descendants of Abel first received the opportunity for the priesthood, he is talking about all white people first receiving the priesthood. He talks about here that he talks about slavery and sin, with Adam and Eve, and then equates it slavery to the devil. So he's wrapping up the curse and the sin and the mark to the devil in here. He also refers to many other disavowed doctrines. He refers to Adam God doctrine because he refers to Elohim as grandfather. So in Adam God doctrine, Michael is Adam, which is our father in heaven, and Elohim is our grandfather. So he refers to grandfather. So he refers to Adam God doctrine. He refers to blood atonement multiple times. He spends time on that. The consequence of a mixed race marriage or a mixed race offspring is murder by decapitation to satisfy blood atonement. And then he says, wouldn't you do this for them? And equates it to the sacrifices of animals in the Bible to worship God, like that you're doing a righteous thing. Now, we don't have any evidence that there were infants that were decapitated or mixed race marriage circumstances where people were decapitated, but this is the language that was used there. And additionally, like we brought this up a little bit, he's talking about the devil ruling, equating the devil ruling in government to black people being able to hold positions of government. And then he goes on this racist tirade about Jews and Africans and Indians and Asians. And so I read this thing and I'm like, this guy isn't my prophet. Like, what is this about? And the essay was dishonest because it takes that partial phrase out of context to lead the reader to believe, oh, Brigham Young prophesied this. There's no big deal. So anyway, that's what I wanted to share about that speech.
Hopefully this will be the last thought about Brigham as we move on to the rest of the essay. Reading this, the part that really jumped out to me was the one thing that he said that proved to be prophetic. Can I read that sentence again?
Go for it.
He said, "I will not consent for one moment to have an African to dictate me nor my brethren with regard church and state government. I may vary from others, and here comes the prophecy. And they may think I am foolish and short-sighted, who think they know more than I do. I know more than they do, consequently." And all joking aside, he knew that actually shows me that he knew he was going out on a limb here, that there were people that did oppose him, that there were people that thought they knew better than him. He was not just a product of his time. There were people pushing back, and Orson Pratt was mentioned. He's like one of my recent fascinations because of he spoke out against Adam God doctrine as well, and the race ban. Anyway, that's the little quote that jumped out to me when we read that. All right.
I think it's interesting. Sorry, just kind of the theme throughout there at the end where he says, "What Gentiles doing, my voice shall be against all day long." That sounds very familiar to me. Just kind of like we don't listen to the world, we do our own thing. And we hear a lot of that in the church, even today, no longer about racism, but we hear it about things like LGBT issues and things like that, where you have to pick. You have to pick. Are prophets influenced by the society at large, and therefore you should take their word with a grain of salt, or do they preach infallible doctrine? You know what I mean? You have to pick your poison.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to read this next paragraph. It's the last one before we get to removing the restriction. So the justifications for this restriction echoed the widespread ideas about racial inferiority that had been used to argue for the legalization of black servitude in the territory of Utah. According to one view, which had been promulgated in the United States from at least the 1730s, blacks descended from the same lineage of the biblical Cain, who slew his brother Abel. Those who accepted this view believed that God's curse on Cain was the mark of a dark skin. Black servitude was sometimes viewed as a second curse placed upon Noah's grandson Canaan as a result of Ham's indiscretion toward his father. Although slavery was not a significant factor in Utah's economy and was soon abolished, the restriction on priesthood ordinations remained. Can I just say I'm very grateful that we have returned to reading complete sentences. It's making my job much easier. I'll move on unless we would like to, you make a comment here about.
So I would say,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So I would say, for clarification purposes, slavery was abolished because the U.S. Congress abolished slavery, not the territory of Utah.
It kind of leads you to believe that Utah decided to abolish it there.
Yeah, well, it lacks that clarity.
Right.
I don't like how it says those who accepted this view, like without specifying, the leaders, because they're not just some random people. The people who accepted this view are the people who were leading the church. They're not, it doesn't go with no consequences. And this kind of wants to brush that over as if, it was just these people over there. No, they were
it's pointing
people
away
leading the church.
Yeah, and it's pointing away from those. It's pointing away from the church leaders to say, no, it's those people that did this.
Yep.
Oh, I'm gonna read this anyway. Sure. So this I found on Mormon Think. It says slavery was abolished by the U.S. Congress in 1862. Brigham Young on slavery was interviewed by Horace Greenlee for the New York Tribune in 1959. So the reporter asked, what is the position of your church with respect to slavery? Brigham Young said, we consider it of divine institution and not to be abolished until the curse pronounced on Ham shall have been removed from his descendants. He's asked, are there any slaves now held in this territory? Brigham Young says there are. The reporter asked, do your territorial laws uphold slavery? Brigham Young says those laws are printed and you can read for yourself. If slaves are brought here by those who own them in the states, we do not favor their escape from the service of their owners.
No, that's pretty clear.
Pretty clear.
Removing the restriction. Okay, we're getting to the good stuff, right? The positive stuff. Okay. Even after 1852, at least 2 black Mormons continued to hold the priesthood. When one of these men, Elijah Abel, petitioned to receive his temple endowment in 1879, his request was denied. Jane Manning James, a faithful black member who crossed the plains and lived in Salt Lake City until her death in 1908, similarly asked to enter the temple. She was allowed to perform baptisms for the dead for her ancestors, but was not allowed to participate in other ordinances. The curse of Cain was often put forward as justification for the priesthood and temple restrictions. Around the turn of the century, another explanation gained currency. Blacks were said to have been less than fully valiant in the premortal battle against Lucifer, and as a consequence, were restricted from priesthood and temple blessings. By the late 1940s and 1950s, racial integration was becoming more common in American life. Church President David O. McKay emphasized that the restriction extended only to men of black African descent. The church had always allowed Pacific Islanders to hold the priesthood, and President McKay clarified that black Fijians and Australian Aborigines could also be ordained to the priesthood and instituted missionary work among them. In South Africa, President McKay reversed a prior policy that required prospective priesthood holders to trace their lineage out of Africa. One more little mini paragraph here. Nevertheless, given the long history of withholding the priesthood from men of black African descent, church leaders believed that a revelation from God was needed to alter the policy, and they made ongoing efforts to understand what should be done. After praying for guidance, President McKay did not feel impressed to lift the ban. All right, let's unpack those last few paragraphs that we just read. So the 1940s and 1950s specifically. I don't want to glance over the rest of Elijah Abel or Jane Manning James' story. I think we talked about Elijah a little earlier. Jane Manning James, does anyone want to jump in and talk a little bit more about not just her being not allowed to participate in other ordinances? There's a little bit more to her story than that is not mentioned here.
I don't know a whole lot about it, but what I do know is that the African American LDS people just bring these names like a lot. But to me, it doesn't move me much. To me, they were oppressed and seen as lesser than, so I'm not impressed.
Yeah.
I see 2 ways in which their stories are used, kind of. I see them as sometimes people are positively bringing forth their stories of their life, just as they were, and kind of raising awareness of the fact that Black Mormons existed in the early church. I think that's a positive thing, just to share their story alongside all the other pioneers. But as you said, Juliana, I see kind of a more negative way in which they're brought up, and I see that in this essay, that they're brought up as like, see, we're not racist, or we're not as racist as you may think, and they do that simultaneously while they're leaving out important aspects of their story that show that, in fact, they were actually these people went through a lot in the church at the hands of the leaders and the doctrine. And one example of Jane Manning James that they leave out that I think was irresponsible for them to do was that she was repeatedly denied the ability to be sealed to her deceased husband in the temple. And that doesn't, to me, that doesn't make any theological sense, because she doesn't need the priesthood in order to do that. So that's why it wasn't a priesthood ban. It was a priesthood and temple ban. And kind of the kicker to all that is that she was allowed to be sealed to Joseph Smith as a servant or a slave, whichever word you'd like to use there, for eternity. So
which makes no sense, right? Because it's like the ordinance works in this situation, but not in this situation. This situation where it's going to serve, me, the powerful white leader. But if we make it's all so just makes no sense.
She in fact was not allowed to enter the temple for her own ordinance. She had to have a white person enter the temple and serve as proxy in order for her to be sealed to Joseph Smith as a servant or a slave for eternity. So imagine just her faith that she had in God and in this institution that she stayed, and that she saw this as good things. And imagine the crumbs.
Well, she probably didn't have a choice, don't you think? Where would she go? She was probably, she had probably like a job or something, or a situation. Where would she go? Yeah, she was probably treated there. And I think that's what they kind of, try to score on. Like, we treated her better than she would have somewhere else. Well, still,
and
she was still lesser than.
Exactly. She was fed crumbs. She was in a faith that she wanted to fully participate in. And I think that's tragic and irresponsible of them to leave it out. If they're going to use these stories of Black pioneers and Black early members of the church, I think that's a positive thing, but you have to tell the whole story or you're being dishonest, in my view.
As a piece of painful context, Wilford Woodruff, he wrote in his journal about President Joseph F. Smith speaking at Jane Manning James' funeral, and this is what he wrote. And so this is not any new information, Ryan, you just told us this, but this was said at her funeral. Quote, when she died in 1908, Church President Joseph F. Smith spoke at her funeral. At her funeral, President Smith admitted that Aunt Jane, as she was known, had been relegated to eternal servanthood in the Mormon realms above, despite being a valiant, faithful church member to the end, end quote. So, I mean, are
we supposed to rejoice for that? Is that supposed to be, she's got his place in heaven.
But I know, I'm trying to call it the context that was said at her funeral.
I mean, seriously.
That's bad stuff.
Yeah.
So in the last year or maybe two, there was a movie about Jane and Emma, and they were good friends, and Jane had a really close relationship with the Smiths. And one thing that she was lobbying for, and that Emma was, would have been supportive of, is for Jane to be sealed to Joseph and Emma as a child. That's kind of what she was shooting for. But Ryan's right. In the end, what they did to try to quiet her petitions is, while she was living, they did a vicarious, special, only been done once, sealing ordinance to seal Jane to Joseph Smith as an eternal servant. Yeah. Read slave if you're going to use Brigham Young's verbiage. So these things are really tough, and so there are Wikipedia pages on these. Like, the listener can look up Jane Manning James or Elijah Abel. They can look up Blacks and Mormonism. There's all sorts of great resources. Earlier in the episode, I suggested Religion of a Different Color. There are more books out today by Joanna Brooks and, by others that are really helpful to understand the history of these things. Also, they refer to this as a policy to a certain extent. And for the listener, if you want to go to Mormon Think's review of this essay, there'll be many quotes where there are official statements from the First Presidency, from prophets and apostles of the church, that this is doctrine, it's the command of God, and so forth. And so, again, as I was experiencing reading this essay, and they refer to these things as theories and policies and things like that, it just felt very, very disingenuous, because I was 12 years old in 1978, and I remember it was taught as doctrine, big D doctrine, at least little d doctrine, but calling these things theories and so forth, it just seems like gaslighting.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to read 2 more paragraphs, my friends. We've got about a page left. We're hitting the home stretch. As the church grew worldwide, its overarching mission to, quote, "go ye therefore and teach all nations," end quote, seemed increasingly incompatible with the priesthood and temple restrictions. The Book of Mormon declared that the gospel message of salvation should go forth to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. While there were no limits on whom the Lord invited to partake of his goodness through baptism, the priesthood and temple restrictions created significant barriers, a point made increasingly evident as the church spread in international locations with diverse and mixed racial heritages. Brazil in particular presented many challenges. Unlike the United States and South Africa, where legal and de facto racism led to deeply segregated societies, Brazil prided itself on its open, integrated, and mixed racial heritage. In 1975, the church announced that a temple would be built in Sao Paulo, Brazil. As the temple construction proceeded, church authorities encountered faithful Black and mixed ancestry Mormons who had contributed financially and in other ways to the building of the Sao Paulo temple, a sanctuary they realized they would not be allowed to enter once it was completed. Their sacrifices, as well as the conversions of thousands of Nigerians and Ghanaians in the 1960s and early 70s, moved church leaders. Church leaders pondered promises made by prophets such. Let me stop there. Actually, let's unpack a little bit. Juliana, what are your thoughts on this Brazil situation?
Well, to me, it confirms that, as I look throughout history, the worth of the soul is second, if anything. It's a church, so I guess that has to matter. But it's decisions are made for economical self-interest reasons. And to this day, it's the same. Eventually, they might lose money not accepting LGBTQ, so they will, So as long as the church doesn't, and same with black people, like there was no economical loss. So dismissing them, with polygamy, it's, sorry, I'm trying to not be too derogatory. I don't want to make anyone cringe, but to me, it says it all. It's like, this is too, Brazil is such a how are you going to start now having everyone do, DNA test or figure out, it's a country made of, white and blacks and all mixed together. That's the majority of the country. So how are you going to navigate through that? So the easy way is let's just forget about this, right? And you see the pressure is getting bigger and bigger as they try to branch out throughout the world that this is not going to work. This policy is not going to work. And so there's no inspiration whatsoever from my observation and analysis of this. It's all self-interested, and if we want to grow, then this has got to go. And for people who are deeply racist, we'll see that it will be a problem. When the policy changes. So yeah, economic interest. That's what I see.
Yeah, correlation doesn't always mean causation, but there certainly is a pattern. Like polygamy went away fake, as a fraud in 1890 because they continued to do polygamy even though they said they didn't. And then in the early 1900s, then it officially went away. But what happened was the federal government was going to go in and seize all the assets of the church, right? So there was a financial interest that somehow we don't have to practice polygamy anymore. Here, was not only the financial interest that's mentioned in the essay, but there were threats to take away the tax-exempt status of the church. There were threats that would affect BYU in terms of government, support,
funding.
things like that, funding.
Protests against their football team.
Yeah, there were going to be boycotts of the BYU football team.
There were boycotts. Yeah,
there already were. Yeah, and so, there is correlation of things moving when there is a significant financial interest to move, and that sounds, like it's very, very skeptical. But I think we at least need to acknowledge that there's correlation in these things.
No, to me, it's a pattern. To me, it's a clear pattern that it's not even hard to see. When you're willing to see it, right? Because there's always that pretty bow of, oh, here's new revelation. God wants this. So that's just like the bow stuck on the, on the letter cover. But anyways.
All right. I'm going to read this next paragraph. Ryan would love to hear your thoughts after we read that. So, church leaders pondered promises made by prophets such as Brigham Young that black members would one day receive priesthood and temple blessings. In June 1978, after spending many hours in the upper room of the Salt Lake Temple supplicating the Lord for divine guidance, Church President Spencer W. Kimball, his counselors in the First Presidency, and members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles received a revelation. He has heard our prayers, and by revelation has confirmed that the long-promised day has come. The First Presidency announced on June 8th. The First Presidency stated that they were aware of the promises made by the prophets and presidents of the church who have preceded us, that all of our brethren who are worthy may receive the priesthood. The revelation rescinded the restriction on priesthood ordination. It also extended the blessings of the temple to all worthy Latter-day Saints, men and women. The First Presidency's statement regarding the revelation was canonized and the Doctrine and Covenants as official declaration too. Your thoughts, Ryan?
Yeah, just as I read that, I see that first sentence there where it says church leaders pondered promises made by prophets such as Brigham Young that they would one day receive the priesthood. And that frustrates me because the only promise that I'm aware of is the one that they tried to spin in footnote number 9, which I believe they very irresponsibly and incorrectly used. He wasn't saying that they would receive the priesthood in this life. And if you look at kind of statements made by the church, you see the leaders kind of further entrenching in this doctrine, saying, no, it's a doctrine. We can't change it. It's a doctrine. There's nothing we can do. It's a doctrine. And then you see after 1978, a change in the tone. It wasn't a doctrine. It was a policy. It was prophesied of, that this was the fulfilling of a prophecy, which they don't have a footnote for that. I would love to see quotes that they could provide showing that someone was prophesying that this day would one day come. They fell short on the Brigham Young one, at least. But I see, I can find multiple examples of prophets and other leaders saying that it will never be changed. Even prophets who were living in 1978 did that. So I'm just disappointed in this essay because it could have been something monumental. It could have brought the faith forward, and I see this as simply spin, for lack of a better word, that they are just skirting responsibility and at the expense of people's pain. They could be explicit. They could say, we were wrong. It was not of God. We're going to make restitution and move forward. And they could have done that in 1978, but they chose not to, and they continue to choose not to take those steps. And I think that's a sad thing.
Yeah.
Have any of you read the McConkie biography?
I have not.
So, and I have not either, but in the podcast I made with Scott D. Miller, right, who wrote the book of A Mormon, he did read it. He's a psychotherapist, and he left a while ago, but he says it was interesting in the biography to read because he tells what's happening in the room when they're discussing issues like that. And he said it was interesting to see that in the room you could tell who the bigots were. Some were and some weren't. And at that point, because people were, you know how it is. Like, it's not like, they all agree on everything. It was pushing and pulling on all these things. And he says, wouldn't you wonder, knowing that these people are in the room, that something's wrong. But they always have to protect each other and appear as a united front. But that's not the case inside of the room. And you have to believe that they're humans and they have their opinions, and you could tell who were kind of the more progressive and not non-progressive. I mean, people can tell who's who, and this was happening in the room. And I think the tension among themselves probably became so great that they also had to move forward with that and do the right thing, basically.
Yeah. So some of the dynamics, scholar Lester Bush wrote a seminal article in Dialogue with regard to the ban and blacks that did hold the priesthood before the ban. And his article was significantly influential to President Kimball. And so there are a lot of apologists or members, defenders of the church today that suggest that revelation is top down. But in this case, it was Lester Bush's scholarship about the history that began to help President Kimball unpack the messiness of this. Mm-hmm. And President Kimball's, I think his son eventually wrote that President Kimball had a copy of Lester Bush's essay in his basement, and he had literally highlighted and underlined and made notes in the margin of almost every single line of that essay and how important that was. So that's one part of the context of what's going on. The second part is Hugh B. Brown, studying the history, believed it was a policy, not a revelation, not a doctrine. So he tried to lobby to move the Quorum of the 12 to disavow it as a policy. And while he was gone on assignment, I think it was Harold B. Lee put together a statement and had all the other members of the Quorum of the 12 sign it, stating that it wasn't a policy and that it would require a revelation from God to withdraw. So that kind of dynamic was going on. And then finally, the third thing is for those that do read the things that Delbert Stapley and Marky Peterson wrote, they were extremely racist. They wouldn't have approved this. They were the kinds of people that said that this is, going to happen. This is not going to be taken away. Delbert Stapley got very, very sick, and he was hospitalized. He died about 2 months after he died in August of 1978. So about 2 months after the quote revelation on the priesthood. So he was not in the room, and the First Presidency specifically sent Marky Peterson away on assignment, so he could not be in the room when this happened. So what happened is, in the room, absent those two members of the Quorum of the 15, they came up with or experienced whatever this was and there's different accounts as to what happened, the revelation on the priesthood. And then they announced it, and then they went to the hospital and told Delbert Stapley, this is what we did. And then they also told Marky Peterson, this is what they did, so that it couldn't be vetoed by them. That's the kind of politics that were going on at the time that the listener should understand.
Interesting.
Let's. I'm going to finish up this section that talks about the room where it happened. Shout out to Lin-Manuel Miranda and Hamilton. Okay. This revelation on the priesthood, as it is commonly known in the church, was a landmark revelation and historic event. Those who were present at the time described it in reverent terms. Gordon B. Hinckley, then a member of the Quorum of the 12, remembered it this way, quote, There was a hallowed and sanctified atmosphere in the room. For me, it felt as if a conduit opened between the heavenly throne and the kneeling, pleading prophet of God who was joined by his brethren. Every man in that circle, by the power of Holy Ghost, knew the same thing. Not one of us who was present on that occasion was ever quite the same after that, nor has the church been quite the same. Interesting to read that after your context of the two men that were not there.
Yeah, because it would have probably felt different if they were in the room.
There may not have been such harmonious
they
atmosphere.
would have vetoed it. It wouldn't have happened if they were in the room.
Back to the essay. Reaction worldwide was overwhelmingly positive among church members of all races. Many Latter-day Saints wept for joy at the news. Some reported feeling a collective weight lifted from their shoulders. The church began priesthood ordinations for men of African descent immediately, and black men and women entered temples throughout the world. Soon after the revelation, Elder Bruce R. McConkie, an apostle, spoke of new light and knowledge that had erased previously limited understanding. It doesn't mention, do any of you, and maybe the answer is no, do any of you know of members of the church that did not react positively?
Yeah, my chiropractor. Yeah, in Mesa, Arizona, there were quite a few people that left the church because they felt it was in apostasy. Just like today, if you speak with very hardcore literalists, DesNat type members of the church, they say that if LGBTQ people are ever accepted in the church, they'll leave the church.
Yeah,
there were people that left the church over this change.
Yeah, I just talked to the older generations, and they all know someone who did. Right. Because my mission presidents told me stories, and yeah, I mean, this is like a little feel good, sentence, just like the experience, right? You have to make it that way. It's a church, right? It's quote unquote. I'm putting quote to that. It's a church. I'm not going to go there, but so you have to make it a spiritual experience that then members can also feel and, be there with them. Like you have to make it that way. And then the reaction of the world, again, it's one side of the reaction. Not everybody reacted positively. I will have to say that, like I was telling you at the beginning that one of my mission presidents told me his experience when, this came out, he was converted to the church, but he was so overwhelmed because he felt so uncomfortable with the fact that black members, because he had black friends, and he was so uncomfortable with it that when he heard it on the radio, he pulled over and really wept for joy, because it's like, finally, because it's like having this super heavy thing on your shelf and it's taken away. And so I'm thinking, imagine you've all heard of Mama Dragons and, Mormon building bridges and all these LGBTQ people who want to make it work. Like if something like that happened, and again, it would be completely split, and we know it would be split. It's not like everyone would be like okay with it, and that's probably why it's not happening, because probably the majority today wouldn't be okay with it. And I don't know what in the upper levels the sentiments are, but I wouldn't be surprised if some people would be okay with it, but not everybody is okay with it, so they're not doing it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like it's always one part of the story that's told, bright light shining on, everything is okay, but it's not.
Yeah. The thing that I struggle with this, people describing that they had so much joy when this happened, that they wept and they had this experience, is that to me is evidence that they knew it was wrong. And yet they said nothing, I won't speak for everyone in the church, but many people said nothing and did nothing, or even worse, tried to defend it as the Word of God. And thankfully, we can look at people within Mormon history that didn't remain silent. People like Orson Pratt, people like Lowry Nelson, like George Romney, like even in the leadership, U.B. Brown was trying to do things behind closed doors. So when I was experiencing this essay for the first time, I was struggling in my faith. And what do I do when I disagree with the leadership of the church that I consider prophets, seers, and revelators? And I never got that answer, other than just remain silent. And I think that we can, as a Mormon community, we can look at examples like the people that I just listed as people who were willing to put their necks on the line, to speak out and say, this is wrong. I sustain the prophets, but they are not infallible, and this is wrong. And I know it's wrong because I feel the Spirit, and it tells me that this is wrong. And that, I think, gives us a framework for what faithful members can do today if they disagree with things like Juliana has referenced, the LGBT issues. I know so many faithful members that disagree strongly with the way that community is treated within our culture. And I think that faithful members and everyone in the community has a responsibility when they see someone hurting, when they see people mourning, to mourn with them and to speak out for them and say what your heart tells you, that this is wrong. And I think that you can do that from a faithful perspective. You don't have to, I chose to leave the church. Many people do, but your decision isn't between silence and totally leaving. It's not those two. You can remain in the faith and speak out and try to change things in a positive way.
As more
there
people,
are consequences to that, though.
Yeah, I was going down the same path.
Speaking up, because I think I tried to speak up and wanting to make it work without agreeing on everything, but you get ostracized pretty quickly, or excommunicated, depending on how loud you speak. So yeah, it's a sacrifice of risk that I believe many won't take because the cost is too high, and for good reasons. I mean, I know personally people today who are remaining totally not believing because they want to save their family, which is a good reason to not, shake the boat because the stakes are just too high. And so to me, it saddens me because it is intellectual and spiritual oppression. Not being able to speak your mind because you're afraid of the consequence. That alone tells you the kind of environment you're in.
Absolutely.
But I admire people who are on the inside who continue that fight, though, because they are also there. People who want to make, so whichever slight changes, positive changes forward. It takes a lot of strength and courage, in my opinion, because I couldn't do that. I listen to all the stuff I disagree with and remain and try to, push things forward in the right direction. So I do admire. Not impossible writing, not impossible, but very difficult.
Yeah, very difficult.
I agree.
All right. The church today. So we've got just these last couple of paragraphs. I'm going to read the first one, then I actually have just a very quick 20-second story. So today, the church disavows the theories advanced in the past that black skin is a sign of divine disfavor or curse, or that it reflects unrighteous actions in a premortal life, that mixed race marriages are a sin. I almost said mixed faith, so let me make sure I said that mixed race marriages are a sin, or that blacks or people of any other race or ethnicity are inferior in any way to anyone else. Church leaders today unequivocally condemn all racism, past and present, in any form. This is a big paragraph. There's a lot of good disavowing the theories. We can argue not even argue, we would mostly agree between the four of us that they could have gone further, and this is where an apology would have been fantastic and warranted. But disavowing those theories is a big deal. And for me, this was one of those moments where I realized what I was up against. Going back to this previous topic of we can speak up. I was speaking with a family member and telling them about how my beliefs had changed. And we talked about race, and they gave me these theories of, well, it was a curse and it was because of unrighteous actions in the premortal life. And I said, the church doesn't teach that. The church has disavowed that. No, they haven't. Where does it say that? Like, well, let me pull it up. And I pulled up this essay on my phone. This was in January of 2018. Pulled up this essay on my phone, and I'm now showing you. You can see me, but the listener can't. I extended my hand with the phone and said, "Here it is. It's on the church website in the Race and the Priesthood essay." And they physically backed up on the couch, put their hands up, and said, "I will not read anything that you give me." And I said, "This is on the church website." the prophet said that was the response. The prophet said that. I said, these essays are approved by the first presidency. I'm not reading it. And it was that moment that I realized this is not a winning battle.
See how deep the damages go, because you see how deep, because habits die hard. And if your brain is wired a certain way, to unwire that is why the depth and the level of, spiritual and psychological abuse is so deep, even for a Black person who's internalized their whole life these kind of theories. Do you think because now that you put an essay like 2 years ago, all of that trauma is going away the next day? It's a lifetime of internalizing and having to, you've lived a certain way, you've thought about yourself a certain way. And that's why what is being said, especially by an institution, has huge impact. And to me, it's even more saddening and upsetting when it's folklore that is creating that damage, spiritual and psychological, because it's not even true. Yet it hurts people. It's false and it hurts people. I mean, that is just incredible,
Yeah.
Yeah, so this was a money paragraph for a few reasons. First of all, I knew that they were at least little d doctrines, not theories. I knew they were testified of with the Spirit. And then it says that that not only is a skin color not a curse, but it says it's not a sign of a curse or disfavor, which is contradicted to scriptures. And so I'm reading this and I'm like, this means that we can't trust, if today's brethren can disavow the testimonies and spiritual witnesses and doctrines and proclamations of past brethren, then it means we can have no confidence that future brethren won't disavow the testimonies and the doctrines, little d and big D doctrines that are taught by today's brethren, and everything is on the table. And like,
I don't know if it's me, but I'm losing it.
Ryan alluded to earlier, when I read this, okay, we're good. When I read this, I was like, oh, they disavowed you got me?
Yeah, we're back. Go ahead.
Okay. When I read this, I'm like, oh, they disavowed the ban. And then later I interacted with people and they said, no, they didn't disavow the ban. They disavowed the teachings or the reasons for the ban, like Ryan alluded to earlier. And that is true. There are a bunch of members who have read this essay that believe, no, the ban was from God, because they didn't specifically disavow the ban. And the backstory is some of the original versions of this essay had the disavowal of the ban, but they didn't think that they could get it approved by the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 to disavow the ban. So they specifically and intentionally omitted, not even just in a policy, but they chose to not disavow the ban.
And yet they are openly contradicting the scripture. Do you see that?
Explain that.
Absolutely.
Saying that the church disavows, theories in the past that black skin is a sign of disfavor, or a curse. I just read to you at the beginning the verse in 2 Nephi saying that's God, that it is a sign of a curse. So you are contradicting the scripture.
Yeah.
So they have a responsibility to contextualize 2 Nephi 5:21, like you're saying. Like if that is in your scripture and you're saying that it's not a curse,
or take it away.
You need to explain that or take it away. Yeah,
which is so horrible, because it's like, I mean, the whole thing. It just keeps on getting, Yeah.
Or be clear that fundamentalist, literalist interpretation of scriptures are unhelpful. Maybe leave the scripture there, but explain that this is script. We don't need to believe that a 600-year-old man built a boat and put a zoo in it. We don't need to believe that there was a single Adamic language on Earth in 2300 BCE. Like, fundamentalist, literalist interpretation of scriptures is unhelpful.
But you see how, despite all of that, a child reading the Book of Mormon and reading that verse who has black skin will internalize and will take it personally. That child, or even an adult, doesn't have the mind to like, oh, I shouldn't take it. They're not going to go through all that, trying to not make it literal, whatever. They're going to be hurt, period.
Yeah.
And that's where my problem is with a lot of these things is you do not realize how hurtful, just like with the policy, with the, children with gay parents. I mean, you throw things like that, not realizing how much it's going to hurt somebody out there, and that is not okay coming from an institution,
Yeah, you can look at the B1 celebration and President Oak's talk there. The leadership clearly still places the quote blame or places the responsibility of the ban on God. God is the reason why there was a ban. He was the reason why there is a ban. It's very clear if you go listen to President Oakes that is the explanation that they're tied to.
because it's taking the responsibility away from themselves. It's an easy blame because what are you going to do about that?
He could have explicitly said. He said in his B1 talk that he didn't feel that it was right, but he expressed that he had to be loyal to the brethren.
He didn't say it wasn't right. He said that he didn't agree with the explanation.
He didn't agree with the explanation.
He did the same thing that essay did.
Yeah, and he could have explicitly said the ban wasn't from God. Like, how many words is that? He could have said that in the B1.
With this specific paragraph here, I think this is the only paragraph that has teeth, but it is still lacking many teeth because you can use this paragraph to say those folklore doctrines, they say it's disavowed. So that is progress. But what it doesn't, one thing that it does is it says racism is wrong, basically, but it doesn't, so people can read that saying racism is wrong and still say that a priesthood ban that based on your skin color, you cannot be a leader in this church or baptize your own child. That was not racism. So they can say racism is wrong, but they don't believe that the ban was racist.
Or like Allan said, they can just dismiss the whole thing altogether because they are so attached to what used to be. Just like because you get attached to what used to be, just like what you've been taught from the moment you're a child, you don't just get rid of it like that. Yeah. It's inside of you, inside of your brain, inside of your. It takes just like anything in life, whatever you. And this is why. Even with, again, I'm going to go back to that example because it's one of the most recent, but with the LGBTQ children who went through that trauma, the fact that they 2 years later, they come out and say, oh, sorry about that. Not true. Do you think that erased the trauma that these people went through or the hurt these parents and children went through? No, it doesn't. Exactly. So you have to think about that, when you come out with, such hurtful things.
All right. Here's the last two paragraphs, my friends. Much of what we've just said is really good conclusion type of statements. So you think of a good conclusion as I'm reading this because we're just about done. Since that day in 1978, the church has looked to the future as membership among Africans, African Americans, and other African descent has continued to grow rapidly. While church records for individual members do not indicate an individual's race or ethnicity, the number of church members of African descent is now in the hundreds of thousands. The church proclaims that redemption through Jesus Christ is available to the entire human family on the conditions God has prescribed. It affirms that God is no respecter of persons and emphatically declares that anyone who is righteous, regardless of race, is favored of him. The teachings of the church in relation to God's children are epitomized by a verse in the second book of Nephi, coincidentally, the same book that you quoted previously, Juliana. Quote, mm-hmm. The Lord denieth none that cometh unto him, black and white, bond and free, male and female. All are alike unto God, both Jew and Gentile, end quote. The church acknowledges the contribution of scholars to the historical content presented in this article. Their work is used with permission. Unfortunately, they're not named because it'd be good to, I think, call out them. But let's unpack this last little bit. So, Ryan, in the B1 celebration, President Oaks used very similar language that the church has looked to the future. Pay no attention to the past. We're looking forward. He uses that same sentiment. What are your thoughts about? I mean, isn't it good to just, okay, yeah, there are mistakes, but let's move forward. Let's focus on what we can do in the future.
So that phrase, the church has looked to the future. That just rings in my ears when I hear that, because and people might think this is kind of too extreme, but I'll use this just as an example. I'm not necessarily equating the two, but if you look at an abusive relationship, it's like the abuser saying, just, I stopped the abuse, so let's just move on. But they do no work to say, what I did was wrong. I am sorry. And then work as hard to repair that as they did to damage, with the damage that they did. And I don't see the church taking those steps. I see the church skirting responsibility. They take a few steps of progress, in this essay, but way, way too few for an organization that claims to be the representative of Jesus Christ on the earth. If they want to look forward with faith to the future, they have to do the work to repair the damage that they have done of 200 years of institutionalized racism and racist doctrines that they taught as the Word of God. And they have to work as hard as they did in instituting that racism, bringing that racism into the world. They have to work just as hard to take it out and to work against the mistakes that they made. They have to admit that they were mistakes. I just think that I think of the quote. I'm going to mangle the quote, but there's a quote that says that there's no greater blasphemy than to take the iniquities of man and ascribe it to the Almighty. And I think that is what we see in the church, that they take the iniquities of people, the racism, and they ascribe it to God and the way that God views people. I think that is it's abusive. And they need, if they want to look forward, and they can, there are lots of institutions that were just as racist as the Mormon Church, but they have done the work to overcome that racism. And it's now the Mormon Church's turn, and they have not done what they need to do to be set free from this stain.
Very well said. Ryan, is that your concluding statement?
I will put that down in the bank. That is my concluding statement.
Right. Anthony, let me ask you, Julianne, I'll give you the final word on this episode and not that it's mine to give, but Anthony, let me ask you with this, in your concluding statements as well, if you could address this very last sentence, where they're quoting the second book of Nephi. Does it feel to you, and I'm trying not to lead you, but here I go. Does it feel to you like ending it on this scripture is a condemnation, like this, treating everyone equally? And Juliana pointed out where that's not always the case in the Book of Mormon, but they ended on a scripture that shows that there shouldn't have been this problem in the first place. And ending with the scripture seems to condemn the actions of the prophets for 130 years. Any thoughts on that? Do you understand what I'm trying to elaborate on here?
Yeah. So Lindsay Hansen Park talks a lot about putting in the work, and when I look at the sanitized version of this essay that came out, but then have also read Dr. Reeves' book and watched his lectures and so forth, like Paul Reeve is putting in the work. Other people are putting in the work. Joanna Brooks is putting in the work, and my sense is that I would speculate that this end part here is something that got put in by someone that is putting in the work to say, look, this was wrong. This is what we need to be about. We need to own our past. We need to not apologize for it. We need to not polish it. We need to not gloss over it. We need to be real about what happened. We need to disavow what was wrong. We need to apologize for ways that we perpetuated it. And we need to move forward. That is the right thing to do. That is putting in the work. And that's how I view ending the essay with that passage of all are alike unto God, male and female, bond and free, black and white, Jew and Gentile. It's a totally different message than what Brigham Young had in the speech that you so gracefully agreed to stumble through. But this, I mentioned earlier that this essay, of all the essays, anecdotally at least, this seems to be the one that most commonly crashed people's shelves or was a final straw or something like that. And it's for a variety of different reasons. For me, it meant that there was no discernment, that God was not interventionist, that the current church leaders choose to be intellectually dishonest and spin things and gaslight things, and that we could have absolutely zero confidence that in anything really that today's brethren say that those things couldn't be potentially disavowed in the future. And that's why it crashed my shelf. But I come from a place of great privilege because I didn't directly experience the trauma and the difficulty that other people experience with regard to the topics of this essay. So this essay and these topics affect a very broad spectrum of members' experiences, and mine were just a sliver. But for mine, this was the essay, as I read this, that the rabbit hole experience opened up. My constructs for spiritual experiences crumbled, which meant for a period of time my constructs for God totally crumbled. And I literally felt like I was falling as I was sitting on my bed reading this essay and that speech. So anyway, that's what I'll conclude with.
Thank you, Anthony. Juliana, any thoughts that you have not gotten out yet, or what would you like to conclude with?
I mean, pretty much what they say. But first, I do want to acknowledge Anthony's experience because as he's saying that, I can see myself going through the same thing. It wasn't the essay who did it for me, but I know exactly what he's talking about and how devastating it is. And that's why I do what I do. I mean, I could just, there was a moment in time where I was like, oh, I'm done with it all. I'm at a good place. I know, I've left it behind, but knowing the pain of people who go through this made me want to help where I can, because I do believe that one of the things we can do in life is if we've gone through something hard and come out somewhat whole, if we can help someone feel a little less pain, because some people go through it alone and they don't need to. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I don't know, what yours, Allan, and yours, Brian, experiences were, but I know it can be super hard and super devastating, and I lived it, so I know. I hope you do realize that we're about to drop a bomb, right? This episode may be the beginning of something for some people who listen to this. So I again want to say, if you're one of these people listening who are like kind of on the fence and this is a trigger, don't shoot the messenger. We're relating personal stories and we're relating facts and stories which we did not create. We're sharing our experiences here, but I do want to tell the people listening that they don't have to go through it alone if they're there. I'm going to just basically repeat what they both just said because it's important. I did learn something on my mission, a thing or two that were true and that were applicable. And for example, with if we've done something wrong, I don't know if you guys had that, but there's this ABCD that you need to follow. Admit, be sorry, correct, and do no more. And the church needs to do that. admit, be sorry, correct where you can, and do no more. And there are ways to do that. To correct. Yes, do come out and apologize, acknowledge the pain, be empathetic, because it means something. It's part of the healing process of all these people who feel the pain. Disavowing is one thing. Saying, hey, I see you, I hear you, I don't know exactly what you're going through, but I'm really sorry. It goes a long way. Until they do that, this is going to follow them forever and ever until they do. I know they don't like it that people bring it on the table over and over. Get over it. Look to the future. No, we're not going to put a blanket and pretend it didn't happen until you do the right thing. So I hope for the people on the inside. I mean, for me, I'm out. So, but I will be glad when I hear that somebody did, because we see and we feel and we hear. The trauma goes deep. And people are still living that trauma as members of the church even. So they need to do a bit more in that direction. And my last word would be just, I do hope people are going to wake up inside of the church and see things for what they are. And I do hope that people are going to choose to do the right thing instead of protecting their comfort zone. So that's my message. And we're here for you if you're hurting.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you said all of that, especially that last part. We're here for you if you're hurting. If you would like to reach out to any of us outside of, I know that we're all on Facebook, so you're more than welcome to reach out to us on Facebook that way. Juliana Villegas, Anthony Miller, Ryan DeRoque, and Allan Mount. Any other, mount.allan@gmail.com. If you want to email me, you can email me. Any other way that you would recommend people get a hold of you guys if they would like to outside of Facebook?
Maybe we can put our emails in the notes.
Great. Yeah, we'll include the emails in the notes for anybody that wants to reach out. Thank you all, the three of you, for joining in this episode and providing your thoughts. I think predictably it went very long because there's a lot to say, and it's a very, very tender and passionate subject for all of us. We'd like to thank the listeners as well for tuning into another episode on the Gospel Topics essays. This one has been a doozy, as many of them are, and we're looking forward to having you on the next episode, which will come out anywhere from 5 to 135 days from now. We'll see. We'll see exactly how. I've committed to sometime the next 4 months, so we'll see.
We'll keep going. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everybody, and have a good day.